Karen had always been a woman who believed in taking matters into her own hands. Whether it was organizing neighborhood watch meetings or confronting delivery drivers for leaving packages at the wrong door, she prided herself on being proactive. But her latest escapade would prove to be her most reckless and life-altering. Yet, it all started on a crisp autumn morning when Karen decided to visit the city's annual Royal Fair, a grand event celebrating the region's history and culture. The fair was held on the grounds of the historic Royal Palace, complete with ornate decorations, live performances, and even a few royal guards in ceremonial uniforms patrolling the area. Karen, dressed in her signature oversized sunglasses and a bright floral blouse, was determined to make the most of her day. As she wandered through the fair, Karen couldn't help but notice the royal guards. They stood tall and imposing in their red coats and bearskin hats, their faces stoic as they watched the crowd. Karen found their presence both fascinating and slightly intimidating. She had always been curious about authority figures, often questioning their decisions and challenging their actions. To her, they represented a system that needed to be held accountable, and Karen was just a woman to do it. The trouble began when Karen approached one of the guards near the entrance to the palace gardens. A small crowd had gathered around him, snapping photos and marveling at his uniform. Karen, however, was more interested in testing his patience. She stepped forward, her hands on her hips, and demanded to know why the gardens were closed to the public. "This is a public event, isn't it?" she asked, her voice loud enough to draw attention. "Why can't we go in there?" The guard, a young man with a stern expression, replied politely but firmly, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the gardens are off limits to visitors today. It's for security reasons." Karen wasn't satisfied. Security reasons? What kind of security reasons? Are you hiding something in there? The guard's expression didn't change. "I'm not at liberty to discuss that, ma'am. Please respect the boundaries." Karen's frustration grew. She hated being told what to do, especially by someone in uniform. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, turning to the crowd. "Doesn't anyone else think this is ridiculous? We paid to be here, and now we're being treated like criminals." A few people nodded in agreement, but most avoided eye contact, not want to get involved. Karen, however, was just getting started. She turned back to guard, her voice rising. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. This is unacceptable." The guard remained calm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back. You're causing a disturbance." Karen's face flushed with anger. "A disturbance? I'm standing up for my rights. You can't just push people around like this." At this point, the guard reached for his radio, presumably to call for backup. Karen panicked. She wasn't about to be escorted out of the fair, not after she'd paid good money to be there. Without thinking, she reached into her oversized handbag and pulled out a small stun gun, a gift from her brother, who had insisted she carry it for self-defense. Karen had never used it before, but in that moment, it felt like her only option. "Don't you dare call anyone!" she shouted, waving the stun gun in the air. The crowd gasped and backed away, but Karen was too focused on the guard to notice. He froze, his eyes widening in shock. "Ma'am, put that down," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "This is a serious offense." Karen's hand trembled as she pointed the stun gun at him. "I'm not going anywhere until you let me into those gardens." What happened next was a blur. The guard took a step forward, perhaps to disarm her, and Karen instinctively pressed the trigger. A loud crackling sound filled the air as the stun gun discharged, its electric current surging into the guard's chest. He stiffened, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed to the ground. The crowd erupted into screams, and Karen stood frozen, the stun gun still in her hand. She had never meant for things to go this far. Within seconds, more guards arrived, their weapons drawn. Karen dropped the stun gun and raised her hands, her face pale with shock. "I didn't mean to. I just wanted," she stammered, but no one was listening. She was quickly restrained and led away, the crowd parting in stunned silence. The injured guard was rushed to the hospital, his condition unknown. As Karen sat in the back of a police car, the weight of her actions began to sink in. She had crossed a line, one she could never uncross. The fairgrounds, once filled with laughter and music, now felt like a distant memory. Karen's day had taken a turn she could never have imagined, and the consequences would be far more shocking than she realized. Karen sat in a cold, sterile interrogation room, her hands cuffed to the table in front of her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on her pale face. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, though she couldn't be sure. Time had lost all meaning since the incident at the fair. Her mind raced with a mix of fear, regret, and disbelief. How had things escalated so quickly? She had only wanted to stand up for herself, to challenge what she saw as an unfair rule. But now, she was facing charges that could change her life forever. The door opened and a stern-looking detective walked in, carrying a file folder. He sat down across from her, his expression unreadable. "Karen," he began, flipping open the folder, "do you understand why you're here?" Karen nodded, her throat dry. I made a mistake. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The detective raised an eyebrow. "You used a stun gun on a royal guard. That's not just a mistake, Karen. That's assault on a law enforcement officer. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Karen's heart sank. She had hoped that explaining herself would make a difference, but the detective's tone made it clear that her actions had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. "I was just trying to stand up for my rights," she said weakly. "He wouldn't listen to me." The detective sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Karen, I get that you were frustrated, but pulling a weapon on a guard? That's not standing up for your rights. That's a crime. And now, that guard is in the hospital. He could have been seriously injured or worse." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "Is he okay? Please tell me he's okay." The detective hesitated before answering. "He's stable, but he's got a long recovery ahead of him. You're lucky it wasn't worse." Karen buried her face in her hands, sobbing. She had never meant to hurt anyone. She had only wanted to be heard. But now, her impulsive actions had caused harm to an innocent person and possibly ruined her own life. The legal process moved quickly after that. Karen was charged with assault, possession of a prohibited weapon, and disturbing the peace. Her bail was set at an amount she couldn't afford, and she spent the next several days in a jail cell, surrounded by strangers who seemed to know exactly who she was. News of the incident had spread like wildfire, and Karen's face was plastered across every news outlet in the region. The headlines were brutal. Karen electrocutes Royal Guard at fair. Stun gun attack shocks community. Fairgoer faces serious charges after confrontation. Karen's family was devastated. Her brother, who had given her the stun gun, was beside himself with guilt. "I never thought she'd actually use it," he told reporters, his voice shaking. "I just wanted her to feel safe." Karen's parents, meanwhile, struggled to come to terms with what had happened. They hired a lawyer, but even he warned them that the case would be an uphill battle. "The evidence is pretty clear," he said during their first meeting. "We'll do our best, but you need to prepare for the possibility of conviction." As the days turned into weeks, Karen's life became a nightmare. She was vilified in the media, portrayed as a reckless, entitled woman who had no respect for authority. Social media was even worse, with hashtags like #JusticeForTheGuard and #BanKaren trending for days. People shared memes mocking her, and some even called for her to be banned from public events for life. Karen tried to avoid the online chatter, but it was impossible. Everywhere she looked, she was reminded of her mistake. The emotional toll was overwhelming. Karen barely slept, her mind replaying the incident over and over again. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus, couldn't think about anything but the guard she had hurt. She wrote him a letter, apologizing for her actions and expressing her hope for his recovery, but she had no way of knowing if he would ever read it. The guilt weighed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the harm she had caused. Meanwhile, the guard, whose name was revealed to be James, was recovering in the hospital. His injuries were serious but not life-threatening, and he was expected to make a full recovery. Still, the incident had left him shaken. In a statement released by his family, James expressed his gratitude for the outpouring of support, but asked for privacy as he healed. "This has been a difficult time for all of us," the statement read. "We're just thankful that James is okay and that he's surrounded by people who care about him." Karen's trial was scheduled for the following month, and the anticipation was almost unbearable. She knew that her future hung in the balance, and the thought of going to prison terrified her. But even more than that, she was haunted by the knowledge that she had hurt someone who was just doing his job. As she sat in her cell, staring at the blank walls, Karen realized that this was a lesson she would never forget. She had always been so sure of herself, so confident in her ability to take control of any situation. But now, she saw the consequences of her actions in stark, unflinching detail. And she knew that, no matter what happened next, her life would never be the same. The day of Karen's trial arrived, and the courthouse was packed with reporters, onlookers, and curious citizens. Karen walked in with her head down, flanked by her lawyer and family. She wore a simple gray suit, a stark contrast to the bold, colorful outfits she usually favored. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she took her seat at the defendant's table. The room buzzed with anticipation, but Karen felt numb. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of sitting in a courtroom, facing the possibility of prison time. The trial began with the prosecution laying out their case. They painted Karen as a reckless, entitled individual who had no regard for the law or the safety of others. They showed footage from the fair, capturing the moment Karen pulled out the stun gun and used it on James. The video was damning, and Karen couldn't bring herself to watch. She stared at the floor, her heart pounding as the prosecutor described the injuries James had sustained and the trauma he had endured. When it was the defense's turn, Karen's lawyer did his best to humanize her. He spoke about her background, her community involvement, and her lack of prior criminal record. He argued that Karen had acted impulsively, out of frustration and fear, and that she deeply regretted her actions. He called character witnesses to testify on her behalf, including her brother, who tearfully admitted that he had given her the stun gun without considering the consequences. "She's not a bad person," he said, his voice breaking. "She just made a terrible mistake." Karen was given the opportunity to speak, and she took it. Standing before the judge, her voice shaky but sincere, she addressed the court. "I know that nothing I say can undo what I've done," she began. "I hurt someone who was just doing his job, and I put everyone at the fair in danger. I was selfish and reckless, and I take full responsibility for my actions. I'm so sorry to James, to his family, and everyone who was affected by what I did. I've learned a hard lesson, and I promise to do better. I just hope that one day I can make amends for the harm I've caused." The courtroom was silent as Karen finished speaking. Even the reporters seemed momentarily stunned by her heartfelt apology. The judge, a stern but fair woman, took a moment to consider everything before delivering her verdict. "Karen," she said, "your actions were indeed reckless and dangerous. However, I believe that you are genuinely remorseful and that this incident has been a wake-up call for you. Therefore, I am sentencing you to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory anger management classes. I also order you to write a formal apology to James and to pay for his medical expenses." Karen nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down." As she left the courthouse, Karen was met with a mix of reactions. Some people shouted insults, calling her names and demanding harsher punishment. Others, however, seemed moved by her apology and expressed hope that she would turn her life around. Karen's family surrounded her, offering words of encouragement and support. "This is your chance to start over," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "Don't waste it.